Before starting every X-ray examination, make sure that the midpoint of your central ray is centered to the midpoint of your IR. Let's start with the projections for the digits. IR used for P projection of second to fifth digits is 8 by 10 inch in lengthwise or crosswise orientation if there will be two projections on one IR. The patient will be in seated position at the end of the radiographic table, and don't forget to protect your gonads. The hand will be positioned with the palmar surface down on the unmasked portion, and the extended digits are separated slightly to place affected part with its PIP joint as the center on the midline portion of the IR. The central ray will be directed perpendicularly at the PIP joint. The radiograph will show the entire digit from fingertip to distal portion of the joining metacarpal and an open IP and MCP joint spaces without overlap of bones. As you can see on my demonstration, the patient can also be seated beside the radiographic table as it depends on their comfortability. I am placing the affected digit centered on the midline of the unmasked portion of the IR. You can also place his handbag below the patient's elbow as a support. The most centered part and reference point for P projection of the second to fifth digit is the PIP joint. Next up is the lateral projection for second to fifth digits. It has two specific projections, the lateromedial and mediolateral, depending on which digit is to be examined. The IR used and patient position is the same as a PA projection. As for the part position, ask the patient to extend the affected digit and close the rest into a fist. For the second and third digit, have the patient's hand rest on its lateral or radial surface. This is a mediolateral projection. For the fourth and fifth digit, have the patient's hand rest on its medial or ulnar surface, and this is the lateral medial projection. The second and fifth digits are resting directly on the IR, and the third and fourth digits are elevated with its PIP joint centered on the image receptor. The two elevated fingers should be supported by the opposite hand of the patient with a radiolucent stick to keep it extended and to avoid movement. The central ray for this projection is directed perpendicularly to the PIP joint. The radiograph will show the entire digit in true lateral position without obstruction of the proximal phalanx or metacarpophalangeal joint by the adjacent digits. It will also show an open interphalangeal joint spaces. You will notice on my demonstration that I use my finger of my opposite hand to immobilize the fourth digit. Again, you have to use radiolucent material that should be held by the opposite hand for immobilization. It just happens that I don't have anything with me while recording that I can use. And you can also place a sandbag as a support underneath the patient's elbow for more comfortability. Now let's proceed to the PA oblique projection of the second to fifth digits in lateral rotation. The patient's forearm is placed on the table with the hand pronated, and from this position, this hand will be rotated externally until the digits are separated and supported on a 45 degrees foam wedge. The PIP joint of the affected digit should be centered on the IR. For the PA oblique projection, the central ray is directed perpendicularly at the PIP joint. So this radiograph will show the entire digit at a 45 degrees angle without superimposition of the adjacent digits and an open interphalangeal and metacarpophalangeal joint spaces. On my demonstration, you will notice that for the second digit, I used medial rotation instead of lateral rotation. It is because placing the second digit closely to the IR can reduce magnification of the entire digit. Thus, it enhances its detail. So you don't have a sponge wedge here, that's why I used a 45-degree cardboard to show you how the sponge wedge should be used on this projection. Now that we're done with the projections of the second to fifth digits, let's proceed for the first digit. It has a different position for each projection since its natural position when the hand is pronated was oblique. So the AP projection of the thumb or the first digit has the same IR that is used and the patient position which is seated at the end of the radiographic table. To position the first digit in AP projection, Rest the posterior aspect of the thumb against the IR by putting the patient's hand in a position of extreme internal rotation. The extended digits should be held by the patient with his opposite hand or with tape. That the long axis of the thumb is in parallel with the long axis of the image receptor. The central ray is directed perpendicularly to the first MCP joint. The radiograph will show the area from the distal tip of the thumb to the trapezium and open IP and MCP joint spaces of the first digit without overlap of bones. Holding the extended digits by the opposite hand with tape can avoid their possible superimposition on the first digit. Next is the P projection of the thumb. The hand is placed in lateral position and the elevated abducted first digit should rest on a support or should be held up with a radiolucent stick. The first MCP should be centered on the image receptor. Central ray will be directed at the first MCP perpendicularly. The radiograph that will be shown by this projection is the same as the AP projection but magnified due to the increased OID of the part being examined. For the lateral projection of the first digit, place the hand with the palmar surface down. The lateral position can be obtained by flexing the fingers to attain the hand's natural arc position or rest the adjacent fingers on a sponge. The long axis of the first digit should be parallel to the midline of the image receptor. First MCP should be centered to the IR's midpoint. The central ray for the lateral projection of the first digit is directed perpendicularly at the MCP joint. The first digit in true lateral projection will be shown on the radiograph. There is no sponge wedge as a support. From the prone position of the hand, flex the fingers on the MCP joint to place the thumb in lateral position. Let us proceed with the PA oblique projection of the thumb. Place the palm of the hand in contact with the IR, and then only articulate the hand slightly and abduct the thumb until its long axis is parallel with the long axis of the IR. Center the MCP joint to the IR's midpoint. Direct the central ray perpendicularly to the first MCP joint. The radiograph will show proper rotation of the phalanges, soft tissue, and the first metacarpal. Next is the AP projection of the first CMC joint, which is the Robert method. In this projection, the patient is positioned at the end of the radiographic table, seated sideways and low enough to place his entire upper limb on the same plane. The posterior aspect of the thumb should be placed in contact with the IR by rotating the patient's arm internally. The hand is hyperextended so that the soft tissue does not obscure the first CMC joint. The thumb is placed at the center of the image receptor. For Robert method, the central ray is directed perpendicularly entering the first CMC joint. But there are two modifications for central ray angulation with the same position. First is the long and rougher modification, in which the central ray is angled 15 degrees proximally to the long axis of the thumb entering the first CMC joint. And next is the Lewis modification with an angulation of 10 to 15 degrees proximally along the long axis of the thumb entering the first MCP joint. These two modifications can visualize the first CMC joint without being obscured by the soft tissue. This method will project the first CMC joint free of superimposition of the soft tissues of the hand and the first metacarpal with a base in convex profile as well as a trapezium. We also have Burman method for the AP projection of the first CMC joint. This method is performed if the hyperextension of the wrist is not contraindicated. According to Burman, this method provides clearer image of the first CMC joint. The image receptor is placed under the wrist and centered at the first CMC joint. The patient will be asked to hyperextend their hand with the use of a bandage looped around the digits that was held by their opposite hand. After hyperextension of the hand, rotate it internally and abduct the thumb so that it will be placed flat on the IR. Burman method has a 45-degree central reangulation towards the elbow through the first CMC joint. This radiograph will show a magnified concavo-convex outline of the first CMC joint. For the first MCP joint, we have PA projection volume method. In this examination, the hand is being radiographed bilaterally. This projection is useful for the diagnosis of ulnar collateral ligament rupture in the MCP joint of the thumb. This is also known as the skier's thumb, as this is a common injury for those who ski. The hands of the patient is resting on their medial aspects. There are materials used for this method. A roll of tape that is placed in between the bodies of the first metacarpal and a rubber band that is wrapped tightly around the distal portion of the thumb. Ensure that the thumb remains on PA plane. Upon exposure, the patient is instructed to pull their thumbs apart and hold. The central ray is directed perpendicular to a point midway between both hands at the level of the MCP joints. This radiograph will demonstrate the metacarpophalangeal joints and metacarpal phalangeal angles bilaterally. If there is an increased angulation on the MCP joint, it indicates a torn ulnar collateral ligament. I didn't have rubber band for this demonstration, but this is how you position for volume method. Thank you for watching.